I hold in my hand the Bible, God's Word. But really, it's really God's story. He's telling me a story, telling you a story. You know, from the very beginning to the very end. It's God's story. And He's the one telling it. That's what I find so exciting about it. Sometimes I like the story, and to be honest with you, sometimes I don't like the story. For you see, sometimes God tells both the good parts and the bad parts. He tells the whole story. You know, I figured out where I fit into that story. I'm excited that God would even include me in the story. There are parts of my story that I don't really like that much, but the good thing about reading God's story is He tells the whole story, and the story hasn't ended. He continues to give me time to change and to write a new chapter. That brings me a great deal of hope. You know, sometimes my priorities aren't where they should be, but I can change that. That's the neat thing about God's story. That's why I like God's approach. The book isn't closed. His story is still being told. Stories give me an opportunity to examine my life in the context of that bigger picture. Perhaps the same can be said of you. For example, I see myself sometimes caught up in the events of oppression of our time. Then I find the story of Moses and the Exodus speak directly to me. Then there are times that Job's experience really speaks to me too. The trials and the difficulties that come my way, well, I have Job to speak to me. Then, of course, there's Daniel and the three Hebrews. They speak to me about facing a challenge, making sure that my values are correct. You see, God's Word continues to speak to me today. It's a very important thing, and I like what God says because He tells me that there is a new beginning coming. And I'm sure looking forward to that new beginning. I'm very anxious for that last chapter to be written so that I can experience that brand new beginning all over again and beginning with Him. God continues to speak to me. You know, He speaks to me through the thou shalt nots, sometimes the thou shalts. But He also speaks to me in those quiet moments when I'm walking in the morning or when I'm driving in the car. God is with me. God is speaking to us today. And He's speaking to me. And you know, that's what I like about stewardship. Because stewardship is part of a relationship that I have with Jesus. Stewardship is really God telling His story both to me and through me. It's about God speaking to me and like I'm one of His own. I'm a partner with Him. In fact, that's what we call stewardship. We call stewardship our partnership with God. I've discovered that I learn most about myself when I learn about God. And that's why Genesis 1 has come to mean so much to me. See, biblical stewardship brings together the insights of who God is and who God says that I am. And this revelation opens the door of understanding and hope that I never had before. Out of the revelation emerges a whole new way of thinking, a whole new way of living. I've discovered that God's story isn't only about what He has saved me from, for God has saved me for something as well. So life takes on a brand new possibility thinking. In fact, my God is a possibility thinker. He sees in me things that I may not ever dream of doing. Stewardship is really a call to mission as we partner with God. And so this understanding starts in Genesis chapter 1 with the words, "In the beginning, God." It is here that God begins to tell His stewardship story. One of the first things we notice as we listen to God telling the story is how He introduces Himself. In Genesis chapter 1, He introduces Himself with a name called Elohim in Hebrew. Elohim describes Him as a mighty one, the creator, the all-powerful one. I mean, He's the creator after all. So we begin to find that this power and this might of God is described very much in chapter 1. We find this, day after day in the creation story. We begin to find God creates this and very good. God creates this and very good. And we begin to find a very exciting event taking place. So God speaks and something comes into existence. God speaks and it comes into existence. And then we come to the creation of Adam and God doesn't speak. He speaks afterwards, not before. What's the significance of this? God speaks before the other creations, but not now as he creates Adam? Why? Simply because the others could not be in a relationship with God, for we are created in the image of God. And at the very beginning, God recognizes there's something different about us. We are created in his image. And for that image, God has created a whole system of support for us. God creates us. You know, as we look at the whole creation story, we begin to realize that there are some very important points that you see creation day after day. It's almost like a worship service. There's a liturgy developing, a crescendo of worship developing. And surely we can see as we look at that there is some 3 points that I would like to make. The first one is the results of this whole creation experience leads us to a sense of adoration for who he is. But it doesn't stop there. For our stewardship indeed is part of that, and we recognize that coming from that is we worship God for what he has done. Who he is, what he has done. We're beginning to get a picture of why our worship and our stewardship with God is so very critical. He is a source of life, and all of creation is dependent upon him. In fact, in verse 29, we see that not only God created, he also sustains by providing the plants that would produce the food for us after we were created. So God created in anticipation of fulfilling our needs once we were created. To me, that's an amazing thing. There is every reason to worship God with grateful hearts. It's no wonder that the Sabbath is the grand climax of a total worship experience. Thirdly, we find that we have the results of this creative experience brings trust and confidence in God. I mean, God is the all-powerful one. So we can be confident and trusting in a God who has that kind of power. Well, notice, as was mentioned earlier, in Genesis chapter 1:29, a description of our responsibility given early on. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Here we find that God has commissioned us to care for the earth that he has created. And in so doing, he gave us the power and the authority to do the work that he has handed off to us. Clearly, only the owner can give such power, such authority to us. We are to fill the earth. And I think we've done pretty well at that. The last time I looked at the population statistics on the earth, we have filled the earth, but have we subdued it? Have we ruled it in a manner that would reflect his principles and his character? We are indeed God's representatives within the created world. Such responsibilities come because we are his representatives. We are created in his image. Our work is not a curse. It's an opportunity to be a partner with God. And this arrangement is a means of helping us grow and become more and more like him. That's my desire. I want to become more like my Creator. This is part of the stewardship package that came along with our creation. God knew that we would feel the greatest fulfillment as we began to move more and more like his image. Well, as you know, things went very well for a while. Well, then things went pretty bad. Next, we're going to look at what went wrong and how that stewardship that God gave us was threatened. We saw in Genesis chapter 1 that the name God used for himself conveyed the meaning of strength. Elohim was an assurance to Moses and to us that no power on earth is more powerful than our God. If you and I ever faced a problem, we would certainly want to make sure that our God was sufficiently strong to do that. That's what Moses needed. That's why it was so important. And that's why Elohim in the first chapter of Genesis is so critical. But as we get to Genesis chapter 2, we begin to realize that power without love can be very cruel and a very dangerous thing. And so in Genesis chapter 2, we begin to find that there is another name for God that is introduced. This name is Yahweh. Genesis 1, we have the all-powerful God, Elohim. We get to Genesis chapter 2, and now the word Yahweh is introduced. That name carries with it the promised keeper, the covenant God, the one who is full of integrity, the one whose word can be trusted. That's Yahweh. That's what we find as we get into Genesis chapter 2. And so we begin to find already in the first 2 chapters of the Bible a characteristic of God that is there. We begin to find a person that we can relate to, someone that we know we can rely on. Not only is he powerful, but he is loving and caring. So when God tells his story, he first tells us how much he loves us. He doesn't begin by telling us where we've made mistakes, where we've fallen, where we've sinned. He first reminds us of who he is, that he has the power to change even the most stubborn lives. This is important because he is often blamed for the way things are. He gives us a choice. We got diverted. We need to understand what really happened. So as we see in Genesis chapter 1, God made a provision for our need. Before we had a need, he created it. If there's anything that the first 6 days said, we begin to understand that surely God provides our needs before we know what they are. It's been said that our life is shaped by the end we live for. Our life is shaped by the end we live for? If indeed we are created in the image of God, then that end that we live for ought to be to reflect the God that created us. In God's plan, the direction of that life is made by the choices we make. So it comes as no surprise that God sought to build relationships by providing choices. It is the very heart, in the very heart of the Garden of Eden, in the middle of all the abundance that surrounded Adam and Eve, God placed a tree. And in that tree, God said, do not eat. It's not good for food. Without the possibility of choosing, there would be no freedom. So that tree really represents freedom, right in the heart of God's garden. Such is the case with stewardship. You see, take away choice, and the very heart of stewardship is robbed. Adam and Eve turned the tree as a sign of freedom into a sign of independence from God. Despite all that Eve had, she needed more. She saw God as a challenge. So the fall of Eve, we begin to find some serious challenges. Notice here, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. There are 3 things that I think are important here. Eve saw what was good for food was not something that God had given for good for food. Eve redefined good, which is one of the characteristics of Satan's temptations. Secondly, it was pleasing to the eye. Eve no longer sought what was pleasing to God. She displaced God and moved herself into the center of the circle. What pleased her became more important than what pleased God. And thirdly, it's desirable for gaining wisdom. This is a very important point. For Eve redefined the source of wisdom. And I'm afraid that we can do that so easily today. Rather than relying on God's word, we find authority in other places. In each case, what was blessed by God was seen through the eyes of what the tempter had said about God, and she began to move away. We begin to realize that God is no longer the center of their life. They begin to move. Eve broke her dependence on God and acted not as a steward, but as an owner. The writer of Genesis makes this 2 very important observations. Their eyes were opened, and then they hid from God. See, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have made it very clear that our Creator God is more than able to meet our needs. God's power is exercised in love. He has power, but he exercises in love. And thirdly, a positive point we have seen is that God intended for us to become his stewards. What happens next is critical to understanding God's story. It is a critical revelation as to what kind of God is, but it is also a revelation of the devastating impact that sin had upon that relationship. God is center of their life. One thing is certain. As we read Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we are each of us near to the heart of God. Near to the heart of God when we begin to bear his image. As we bear his image, we become fulfilled and joyful as a steward of God. So I invite you, as we begin to think about it, let us be aware that indeed we are being drawn to the very heart of God. Greetings. I have with me two very special friends. I have Hugo and I have Kathy, and they have joined me as we take some questions from the air. Some of you have sent in some questions, and they're very good questions. So we're going to take a few moments to take a look at this, and then a little bit later I'll wrap up with where I was going a little bit ago. The question that has been handed to us is this: what are some of the practical ways in which I can ensure that God is Lord of my life. So, Kathy, Hugo, which one of you would like to be first?
Well, I think it's a tough question in a way, because we all have different ways of looking at my Christian life. For some people, may be different than others. I may say something that may sound too ruly to someone, and to the other person it could be just fine. So I think in my mind I will say, how can I be connected more personally, in which I can get that kind of experience.
But let's talk about that, because I think you've hit the real issue on hand here, and that is, how do we ensure that abiding relationship with God, so that we can keep that, what I would say, that if we want to say discipleship, I know that's a little bit different, but discipleship, Kathy, that's a big area for you. But discipleship, relationship with God, how do we keep that fresh?
At least every day. And I would think, boy, I can do that in the morning, but is God the Lord of my life when I go to TJ Maxx or to another store where there's lots of lovely sales on things that I might not really need? That makes it really practical.
What do we do? What do we do? How do we strengthen that relationship? What do you do?
One thing I think I'm still trying to learn and grow in my life is how can we not separate my life into different perspectives?
Compartments.
Exactly. Yeah. If I am a God follower, a God believer, I shouldn't have that. I think I need to do everything, in one reality.
We don't separate our life into this is now my secular life, now this is my spiritual life.
There you go.
But let's talk a little bit about how do we ensure that? I mean, where does the Bible study come in? Where does the prayer come in? I mean, But
I can pray and study the Bible, and it's still about me. I want to be holier. But I'm kind of working with, I need to die.
Well, what do you mean? I mean, that sounds scary.
I know,
I mean,
but
we don't want any suicide here.
No, but dying to self, there can be no self. That's what, God will not take over our self. But if we lay down our self and say, you take over and live through me, then maybe he has more possibility.
I think, I'm looking at the time, go quickly. We do have another question here. But I think what you've said is very important. I think one of the greatest challenges that I face is that I find that self really kind of dominates my thinking at times. So it can stand in the way of my Bible study. It can stand in the way how I want to prioritize things with my wife or my children or whatever, how I live for others. There is another question here that we really have to get to, and that is, ruling over all things was expressed in Genesis. Can you share some other texts on stewardship? Let me share with you just one text, and it kind of goes along with what you just said earlier. It's one of my favorite texts. And you haven't normally thought of stewardship this way, but here's what it says. It's Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. When you talked about giving up self, I thought of this verse. Hugo?
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, and then you can also find on John 15. The parable of the vine.
Abiding.
Exactly. You cannot be separated from me and then bear good fruits.
Right.
That I think that's a very powerful text as well.
As Jesus was connected to the Father, so we are, and he used the vine in John 15 as that illustration. I think it's verse 5 that says, I can do nothing without being connected with the Father. That's a paraphrase.
Yeah, imagine if Jesus needed that, how much more us?
Yeah. Well, listen, it's time for me to give a short wrap-up of where we've been so far. And I would like to just direct our audience back to some of the things we've talked about already. The first 3 chapters of the Bible are focused on answering 2 very important questions. Who is God, and who are we? Those 2 questions are explored in several different ways. These questions form the basis of stewardship. While there are many ways in Genesis for describing God, we have pointed out to the two names that God uses. God introduced himself by using two names, Elohim, the all-powerful one, and he also used the name Yahweh, the relational God, the God of promise, the covenant God, the God who is involved with our daily activities. Secondly, we learned that we used both Elohim and Yahweh, but also there are these are two qualities that are important to understand at the very, very beginning. We've seen that God created us in his image, that we have a responsibility for caring for his creation, responding to each other. We were reminded that God had provided for our every need before we were ever created. And we learned that one of the principles of stewardship is that God's grace always precedes any responsibility that he gives to us. The war in heaven, for example, was indeed an illustration of Satan's ambition to be equal with God. He sought to take upon himself the privileges that only belong to the Creator, to the owner. His ambitions were made manifest in the temptations brought to Eve. Eating the forbidden fruit was indeed a choice that she made. It was the giving up of her freedom, not the exercise of her freedom. That it wasn't the use of the choice was her freedom, but she gave that up as she began to make the poor choices. I'd like to suggest that as we look at Genesis chapter 1, in Genesis 2, God is telling us who he is and who we are. That's very important. But you know what happened. They fell. And once they sinned, they began to realize that they were indeed separated from God. Their conscience came. They went and hid from God. And God came to them with a question, where are you? And he asked two very important questions. The first question to Adam and Eve is, where are you? Where are you in your relationship with me? In Genesis chapter 4, we have the story of Cain and Abel. And there we find God coming to Cain and saying, where's your brother? And so we find two very important questions that God is asking of you and me today. Those are stewardship questions. Where are you in your relationship with God? And secondly, where are you in your relationship with others? How are you caring for them? And so I leave you with these questions. Where are you and where is your brother?
Look, Daddy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Everything we own is a blessing from God. All of it belongs to him. God only requires 1/10 to be returned to him as an act of worship and an expression of our faithfulness to him. Tithe is God's money. And in tithing, we're simply returning to the owner what rightly belongs to him. And as we faithfully return 1/10 of our income, we will continue to provide for us according to his promises. Tithing is one of the most tangible ways to experience God. It's a most rewarding step of faith and a wonderful testimony of our faith. Take that step of faith today and experience God's faithfulness.
This one's for Jesus.
Remember, stewardship is my all in response to God's all.